Hello, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Professor, a crowd-driven, crowd-funded feature in which we respond to your questions with your support on everything from history to political philosophy to culture to religion, if you want to ask about that, all those things that matter to us in our common life.
All right, here's a good one from Andrew. He's asking, why is abortion a conservative issue? It is certainly a Christian issue, and many Christians are conservative, but would a conservative atheist be anti abortion?
I think that's an excellent question, or a series of questions bundled together, because one might take a step back and say, is abortion a conservative issue? And if you look at the matter historically, you might well be inclined to say, no, it's not. That you go back 30, 40, 50 years, and you will find people who are very firmly liberal, as we would now understand that term, who are also firmly pro-life. In fact, you could go back to the so-called first wave feminists, the latter 19th century women who argued that if women had the vote and a greater say in public and life and in social affairs generally, the world would be a better place because women were different and better, that they were kinder and gentler and so forth. Well, those feminists were firmly pro-life. They thought abortion was a dodge for men to seduce women and then abandon them. Archaic as that may sound, it was at the time part of progressive thought. But at the same time, if you were to look at the present day, and you were to take a sample of countries whose politics you were unfamiliar with, and just find out which parties seemed to be at least partly pro-life, you'd have a pretty good idea which parties also favored more spending on defense, wanted more robust controls on immigration, probably were more militant about balancing the budget. They do all seem to come together. But that then raises the next question, because I said conservative, I didn't say Christian. And then there becomes the question, would you find that a majority of Christians who are active in politics adhere to those conservative parties? In short, is conservatism Christian or vice versa in the modern political world? And again, at least in the United States, which I know best, that certainly didn't used to be true. Until very recently, knowing whether an American regularly attended church gave you no indication of whether they would be a registered Democrat or a registered Republican. But recently, over the last 20 years or so, that has changed. Increasingly, for the first time in the history of the Republic, church-going correlates with partisan preferences. And I'm thinking, just loosely here, in Germany, you used to have the Social Democrats squaring off against the Christian Democrats. Of course, just because you call yourself Christian doesn't mean you are one. Many talk of Robin Hood who never pulled his bow. But there does seem to be some sense in which there is a correlation between Christianity, conservatism, and a pro-life stand. And why should this be? And again, it's not universal. I think you will still find some people on the left who are pro-life, although they are increasingly drummed out of their parties. Again, the American Democratic Party, like the Canadian Liberal Party, has made it clear that we're a big tent that does not welcome pro-lifers here. Yuck, get away from me. And you also see this in American politics, by the way. One of the significant cultural changes that led to a political change is that until the 1970s, American Protestant churches were not pro-life. As a matter of fact, when Roe v. Wade came down, the rather bizarre American Supreme Court decision in 1973 declaring that there was hidden in the Bill of Rights, unsuspected by anybody for centuries, a firm right to abortion, the Southern Baptist Convention welcomed it as a blow against encroaching papist power in America. But then Protestants became pro-life and Catholics became Republican. Interesting tectonic shift in American politics. So again, why would such a thing be, and where does it leave atheists if they are otherwise conservative or even libertarian or even more conservative in other ways? Is there something about an attachment to the permanent things, a transcendent law, that makes you more pro-life, and something about believing that we make our own rules that makes you more pro-choice? Because Christians believe that there is a moral law written on the human heart, St. Paul puts it, and that there is a lawgiver, that there is a God. And there are some conservative atheists who believe, or agnostics, who are convinced there is a moral law, that right and wrong cannot be changed by human decisions, that we don't decide morals, we discover them, even though they either don't know if there's a lawgiver or else deny that there's a lawgiver. And where would those people be on the question of abortion? If there is a natural law, if some things are inherently right and others are inherently wrong, and they would be right even if nobody believed in them, that there would be such a thing as a color red if there were no red objects, would killing the unborn, under most circumstances, if not all, necessarily be in that category? And it seems to me that it would. And I say this, although I am a Christian. I was pro-life long before I found God or he found me or whatever it is that happened. It somehow seems to be inherently wrong to take another life, especially a helpless one, for your own convenience. And some people would make exceptions, either because the child is simply not viable, they will have a short and miserable life, or because the mother was the victim of rape or incest, and therefore she did not consent to the pregnancy, and therefore the child, although they have a right to life, their right really does conflict with her right to bodily integrity, and in this case the child is simply out of luck. So you can see people who'd make exceptions, but still take that general position that there is an inherent right to life, and we may not violate it for our convenience, even if there might be grounds under which we could. And so this takes us to the other side, to the left. Does the left believe in an unchanging moral law or not? And again, if you were to go back, let us say to the 1960s, and think about Martin Luther King Jr., who was, of course, a Christian, and in some ways I would say he was quite a conservative person, but civil rights is clearly a move to change society. It very much became a cause of the left, although, interestingly enough, a larger proportion of Republican than Democratic congressmen voted for the Civil Rights Acts of the mid-1960s. However that may be, Martin Luther King and many of his liberal colleagues at the time were pro-life, so it's not impossible for a liberal to be pro-life, including some who were not Christian. But nowadays, let them speak out of their own mouths. How many liberals today are pro-life, with, as I say, possibly some qualifications, but as a general rule, a woman may not have an abortion just because she does not at the moment want to have a baby or does not feel able to cope with having a baby. How many would you find? And so that suggests, yeah, abortion is a conservative issue. Because, well, why? How many liberals today believe in an unchanging moral law? I mean, you could point to the contradiction of insisting that some things are right and some things are wrong. Say, don't be judgmental. You know, they're judgmental about judgmentality. There's a kind of paradox there, but let's not, drill into that particular foundation of their beliefs. Let's take what they say at face value. How many of them believe that right and wrong are subjective, and how many believe that right and wrong are objective? And how many who believe right and wrong are subjective would then subjectively decide that abortion shouldn't be allowed? I think that's a pretty much an empty category. So you're left with those liberals who believe in an absolute moral law and think that includes protecting the unborn. And then they have the same question as the conservatives. Is there a law without a lawgiver, or is there a law and a lawgiver? Because there are plenty of religiously motivated liberals. To this day, there are some liberal churches. Their devotion to religion is sometimes suspect, but again, let's not get into that. Let's take them at their word. So yes, there are presumably some liberals who are pro-life, but there aren't very many. There are some liberal Christians who are pro-life.
But one counterexample is the issue of sex-selective abortion. There you will find a lot of people who typically tend to be on the left suddenly saying, oh, wait a minute, why are you killing a baby just because it's a girl?
They do, but would they outlaw it? But you know what?
There's a lot of pro-lifers that don't really want to criminalize abortion either. I mean, but you see that reaction suddenly because it's a girl. That's not as okay as we thought it was.
Yeah, there is some ease. Or what if a conservative couple, religious or otherwise, discovered that there is such a thing as genetic disposition to homosexuality, found out their baby was likely to be homosexual and decided to have an abortion? Mm-hmm. How far would we get with her body, her choice? But here's another interesting example, Pope Francis. Because in many ways, he is a man of the left. In my view, he says some awfully daffy things about economics and even the environment or foreign policy. But he's certainly vigorously pro-life. But that brings us back to another thing that Pope Francis very much is, a Christian. So the question, is abortion a conservative issue? Is abortion a Christian issue? And is Christianity inherently conservative or vice versa? And I would say in this regard, the tendency is very, very strong for abortion to be a conservative issue these days, because conservatives, by and large, now are the ones who believe that there is such a thing as an unchanging moral law. Liberals believe in be yourself, make your own rules, that kind of thing. And to the extent that Christians find themselves on the conservative side. Therefore, you find this congruence between being pro-life, being conservative, and being Christian. But there certainly are honorable and intellectually coherent exceptions to it. And yeah, I have met libertarians who were atheists and who were also pro-life. I believe Ron Paul was in that category. Not sure if he was an atheist, but he was certainly a libertarian who was very much at odds with conservatives, and he was pro-life. But he was in a minority among libertarians.
He's also a doctor. I think that helps sometimes.
Which might well be, although of course, presumably abortionists are also doctors. But yeah, I would think most physicians cherish life to the point that even if they are liberal on most political issues, they're uneasy with abortion. So I think that it comes down to this question of belief in natural law, in an unchanging moral law that is discovered, not invented. And the more you believe in that, I think the more likely you are to be pro-life. And I think in our time, more and more people who believe in an unchanging moral law are being driven by a kind of clarifying process to be politically conservative. And then, of course, Christians and Muslims and Jews and others would say, how could you have a law without a lawgiver? And therefore you tend also to find the religious people on that side of the issue. So I think that's why they tend to be that way. But humans are diverse, and there are certainly intellectually coherent alternative positions, including people who are Christian, pro-life, and liberal on most issues, people who are not Christian, who are pro-life and are conservative on most issues, and even I would think some people who are not Christian and not conservative, but are pro-life. And you know what? When it comes to saving the lives of the unborn, I'm happy to work with anybody who favors that cause, as I'm happy to work with anybody who favors almost any good cause, although I would always try to get people to adopt an intellectually coherent position, and as humans will, I tend to think that's the one that I hold myself. If I didn't, I wouldn't hold it. That's not just intellectual partisanship. So yeah, abortion is a conservative issue increasingly. It is a Christian or religious issue increasingly, but not exclusively. And the first question everybody needs to ask themselves here is, do I believe in objective standards of morality? And then they have to ask themselves, why do I believe that? You get those two right, and I think everything else will fall into place.
All right. Well,
if you're enjoying these features, please visit my website. That's johnrobson.ca. Make a contribution to help sustain our work.